Hi folks, we're going to kick off today with getting into chapter 2, Thinking Like an Economist. In this chapter, we're going to do a brief overview of kind of the role of economists, what their job is, the aspects of them as a scientist and a policymaker, and also some of the general models we use in this field. So, with that in mind, let's kick off with just kind of talking about what is an economist. Really, economics is divided into two aspects. There's the scientific aspect, in which economists use assumptions to create models, economic models, to study efficient production possibility frontiers. And the reason for this reliance on models is two. One, we can't actually conduct experiments in the real world, right? Like the economists, they can't say, I'd like to study the effects of depression. The US isn't going to be like, well, here's the economy, let's cause a depression, and you collect your data. That's really frowned upon. So instead, economists use models that simplify the more complex situation that is reality, and they omit certain variables or hold other variables constant to kind of gauge the impact of one thing. And what we mean by that is, for example, what if I'm curious about the effects of race on income? What I might do is I might try to hold variables like education, gender, these things constant, i.e. what I mean is I cross them and I just test and see how race affects someone's income over their lifetime. And that's one of the ways economists try to explore racial disparities and prejudice. And this is one of the things that models play a role in devising. And so models play a role in devising these solutions and theories. So economists devise theories, they collect data, and they analyze this using the scientific method. Now, to that end, you then have the economist as a policy advisor. And so what we mean here is that there's two aspects of being an economist. There's positive and normative aspects. Positive aspects are the economist as a scientist stating relationships. And they'll say something like, well, inflation is likely to increase as unemployment decreases, which if you'll remember, that's principle 10 from last chapter. So this is a positive statement. It's a statement that is testable, verifiable, and a factual statement. The other aspect is normative statements, and these are goals and ambitions, and this is a value statement. So for example, a normative is everyone should have access to affordable health care. The goal and purpose then is to identify policy that is most efficient and equitable, and this is what economists as policy advisors tend to do. As a secondary goal, they also try to see how this policy will be perceived by the public and portrayed by the media. And one of the tensions here is that economists have to explain their terminology in a way that addresses people's perception of what economists do versus the reality of what the policy is. So for example, think about one, the Affordable Care Act. Think two about tax cuts. These are two things that almost always in the news labeled as very like political. Here's a perfect example, corporate tax cuts. There's actually like a very legitimate argument around whether or not corporate tax cuts should go up or down, but like inevitably, right, it is the perception that people have of what corporate tax cuts are achieving in the US versus the reality of what they're accomplishing. Whoop. Let's go back here. So this is our first model. This is the circular flow diagram, and this is a very simple model. In this model, we have two types of actors, and by actors, we mean the decision makers. In this case, you have households over here, and firms, which would be like businesses. Households are you, your family members. Firms are businesses, corporations, etc. There are two markets that households and firms interact in. They interact in the markets for goods and services, this top one, and then they interact in the markets for factors of production, this one down here. Now, what are these two markets? The market for goods and services is the markets you and I engage in, right? So like when we go to the store and we buy food, or when I go to a barber and get a haircut, these are markets for goods and services. Meanwhile, firms are engage in a market for factors of production. And in this, they're looking to buy labor, land, and capital, which you'll see over here. So this is what the markets for factor of production is buying labor, land, and capital. So what the circular flow shows us is who's buying and who's selling in any market. So let's just think about for the markets for goods and services. It's clear, right? Like we intuitively know we're the buyers. So we spend money on goods and services, which turns into revenue for firms. But interestingly enough, in the markets for the factors of production, we're the sellers. So households, we sell our labor, our land, or our capital to firms. And firms in turn pay wages, rent, or profit to households. So they pay us for their factors of production, which is wages for labor, rent for land, profit for capital, which becomes income for households. And so this is the flow, is you have households buying goods and services and households selling factors of production, with firms buying factors of production while selling goods and services. Now, the next model is the production possibility frontier. Unfortunately, for some reason, this is being weird and the curve itself is not growing up, but we can look at the table and this will make it clear. So what I want you to do is look over here at this employment of labor hours. So first things first, we have basically a total of 50,000 hours, labor hours in the economy. And we have the option of putting those 50,000 hours into computers and or wheat. So for a simple example, let's just assume that we put all our labor hours into computers. We would get 500 computers. Since we didn't put any labor into wheat, right, it makes sense that we don't produce any wheat. So if I took this 50,000 hours and I got 500 computers, I would know that the outcome is we get 500 computers and 0 wheat. And so if you were plotting this graph, you'd put a point right here. Now let's look at the extreme opposite angle. We would go down here, right, and we'd see that you have 50,000 hours in wheat and 0 hours in computer. Well, it makes sense we'd get 0 computers and 5,000 wheat. So we'd come over here to our graph and we'd plot a point here. The production possibility frontier is just a line that connects this point here of 5,000 wheat, 0 computers, to 500 computers and 0 wheat. And it shows us all the possible combinations of computers and wheat we can produce spending our 50,000 labor hours on either or. So you can see over here how, like, if we split these up at point A, we only get computers and 0 wheat. But if we move, say, 10,000 hours to producing wheat and leave 40,000 computers, we get 400 computers and 1,000 wheat produced. And this is what this table shows. And so this table shows like all the different combinations of hours we can spend and the certain outcomes. And the curve itself reflects that table. Now, some things about the production possibility frontier. Any point along the PPF, like A through E in our last example, is a possible production for the firm. And if that point falls along the line, it's considered efficient to the extent that all resources are being utilized. Now, any point below the PPF is possible, but what that means is we're not being efficient because we're leaving a lot of labor hours open to be used. So this would mean workers are unemployed, factories are idle, etc. And then any point above that curve is not possible with our given resources. And what that means is that we need more labor hours than we currently have to produce those levels. So for example, right, like I can't produce 600 computers and no wheat because I only have 50,000 hours and I can only produce 500 computers. Now you can increase this by a growth in the factors of production and of resources and technology, but similarly it can contract due to decreases such as war and famine. Now the opportunity cost on production possibility frontier, again, I wish we had this curve, but for some reason this isn't showing up. The long story short, though, is that the slope of a line equals the rise over the run, i.e. how much are we going up versus how much are we going across. And you gauge this by the rises going up or down over the run across, left to right. And that is our opportunity cost. So for example, if you say we're at 6,000 wheat and we want to produce 100 computers, we go down to 1,000, 5,000 wheat, 100 computers, that would tell us that the opportunity cost is 10 wheat per computer in this example. That's the rise over run. We went down from 6,000 to 5,000 and we went to the right 100. Now, this kind of gets into the economist as a policy advisor. As scientists, economists make positive statements which attempt to describe the world as it is. We face a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, the example I gave you earlier. As policy advisors, economists then try to take these positive statements and make normative statements from them. So if we know there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, and we know that lower unemployment means more Americans have affordable health care, like we could consider that inflation is a trade-off for this. Positive statements can be confirmed or refuted. Normative statements cannot. I can't tell you the argument that no, Americans should not have access to affordable health care, and I can't prove to you that statement's wrong, right? However, I could prove to you that there isn't necessarily a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Government employ many economists for policy advice, e.g., the Council of Economic Advisors, which the person that wrote our textbook, Mankiw, actually was George Bush's for 3 years. He was the head of that Council of Economic Advisors. So you might be wondering, well, if economists are scientists, then why do they disagree? And they often give conflicting policy advice. And the reason is that sometimes they disagree about the validity of alternative positive theories. So I go back to inflation and unemployment. This is actually debated because the question is the unemployment that comes, or is the reduction in unemployment greater than the inflation that comes? If that is, then maybe inflation is worth it. If the counter argument is that no, the inflation is much higher than the amount of unemployment it reduces, then that gets kind of complicated. They may have different values too, and therefore different normative views about what policy should try to accomplish. So we mentioned Arthur Oakham last chapter, who is very interested in equality and very focused on how can the U.S. create a more equal society. In contrast, at the same time, there was another economist, Milton Friedman, who's a Nobel laureate, and Friedman was very much interested in individual liberty. And so to his mind, he thought government policies which attempted to aim for equality actually reduced individual liberty, and he believed more individual liberty actually reached greater equality. And so this kind of debate, which is better, is something that economists do, and those were two different normative views that leads to like a debate we still deal with today. As scientists, economists try to explain the world using models based on assumptions, and the reality is that there's disagreements over whether those assumptions are valid or not. And as policy advisors, economists offer advice on how to improve the world. But if the models are in disagreement, that can lead to different conclusions about what advice can improve the world. Now, I want to pop back to this idea of just a quick math review. Let's talk about the slope of curves real quick. This is a little bit tangential to this topic, but it is important. If a curve is a fairly flat upward sloping line, and basically like imagine this is kind of, well, my direction. Imagine a line like this going from like, this is the origin of the graph, right? Fairly flat. This means that it's a small positive number, and that means it's more sensitive to change. And if it's a steep upward sloping line, that means the slope's a large positive number, and that's less sensitive to change. Now, a downward sloping line like this would mean that the slope's a negative number. A horizontal line means the slope is 0, and a vertical line means that it's an infinite slope. And it's worth always considering any omitted variables that may lead to deceptive graphs. And again, this was a quick chapter, folks, so we're going to end there. And this will finish chapter 2, and we'll visit next video, chapter 3, which is interdependence and the gains from trade. All right, thank you guys. Y'all take care.